Welcome to Breaking the Mold, a podcast from Action Funder. Here at Action Funder, we work with businesses and we work with non-profit leaders. We enable the two to work together to create measurable change. In this podcast, we're going to introduce you to some of the change makers we work with, we know and we admire. They'll be coming to us from boardrooms and community centres across the country. Together, we'll tackle questions about sustainability, about working in partnership, and about achieving real impact. Get ready to hear about what challenges and drives these people who are dedicated to taking action on the issues that really matter. I'm Lorna, and this month I'm talking with Sarah Mitton about Clarion Futures, the charity arm of the UK's biggest housing association, Clarion Housing. As Clarion's communities manager, Sarah runs programmes that foster intergenerational connections, tackle loneliness and isolation, and encourage biodiversity. In this conversation, we dig into the recipe for running an effective community programme and the working partnership between Clarion Futures and Clarion Housing. We also talk about play, an element of life that few professionals get the chance to bring into the workplace, despite the creative innovation it can foster. Let's dive into it. Sarah Mitton, welcome to Breaking the Mold. It's really great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Nice to meet you.
So this podcast is all about how different sectors can work together to create positive change at a local level. And I'm really excited to talk with you today to find out about Clarion Futures, which is the charitable arm of one of the biggest housing associations in the UK, responsible for providing homes for hundreds of thousands of people. Before we dig into the nitty-gritty of all of that, though, I'd love to hear a bit about what you do and why. So would you help us out by kicking off with a brief intro to Clarion Futures and a bit about your role there?
Yeah, absolutely, Lorna. And thank you for having me on the podcast. It's really exciting to be part of this series, which I think is really, really important because it's all about sharing learning and best practice. And that's how we do what we do. So my role at Clarion Futures is I'm our age-friendly communities manager. So essentially my role was born out of a strategy which we pulled together at the Housing Group about 3 years ago, which essentially means that what we're looking at is how we work with people across a life cycle. So rather than just shaping our programs dependent on age, we appreciate that actually we have far more in common across generations than that allows for. And so our age-friendly strategy essentially says the earlier you work with people, the less likely they are to reach age-related crisis, but actually that we all have crucible moments in our lives where your housing provider might play a role in giving support or giving guidance and opportunities or signposting to things that will help you to thrive within your life and within your community. So I sit within the communities team, but we do have lots of other functions as part of Clarion Futures. So we support people with jobs and training, with looking at their energy costs, which has been even more important over the last year as many of us, we all know that actually there's a cost of living crisis and many people living in our communities are really feeling the pinch as a result of that. And we also have a social value team. So we work with contractors in our communities to make sure that we're reinvesting back into the places that matter. And one of the biggest things that we've been working with Backyard Nature is around giving access to green spaces to both young people, but older residents in our communities too.
I'm really interested, Sarah, to know more about the connection between Clarion Futures and Clarion Housing, because obviously Clarion Futures is totally focused on that positive change and positive impact and social value piece. But Clarion Housing is responsible for housing people, which is an essential social action in society. So how are the two connected, and what is the responsibility of a housing association?
That's a really great question. So we are one part of a big business. So we are, as you mentioned earlier, we're the largest social housing provider in the UK. So we have around 130,000 homes and around 360,000 people call a Clarion home their home. So we feel that actually as a housing provider, we have a responsibility to play in terms of not just making sure that people have got a roof over their heads, but also making sure that they're able to put down roots, to grow and to thrive within their communities. So we see ourselves as being more than just a housing provider, more than bricks and mortar. And as I kind of outlined before, we have lots of ways that we're trying to work directly with residents and people within wider communities to make sure that people want to stay. They want to, grow old in our properties, and that they feel connected to their community, and that they also feel like an active citizen in the place where they live. And so a lot of our projects really are focused on wellbeing, about place and space making. That's why we exist as Clarion Futures.
So what you do is totally focused on creating positive impact, and what you've just gone through, which we'll dive into more of in a minute, really thinking about some of those projects and programs. But there's a lot of it. And what motivates you to do this work? How did you arrive in it? And what keeps you going as you come up against, I'm sure, a multiple challenges working with so many different partners?
I mean, I guess if I talk for Clarion Futures, and then I'll talk personally why I do the job I do and why I do genuinely love it 99% of the time. I think for Clarion Futures that actually we do feel that there are lots of challenges facing society, and some of those are heightened in more deprived communities that perhaps haven't had access to funding, haven't had investment, haven't had the support that perhaps is needed to allow people to grow and access opportunities around them. And so I would say that everyone that works for Clarion Futures is personally invested in making sure that we support people, and we kind of do everything that we can to create these neighbourhoods that are connected and where people have positive well-being. And I guess that's exactly the same for me. So I grew up with deaf parents, and I think that probably in lots of ways sort of made me see what it can be like for people that perhaps have disadvantage and that actually can't easily kind of connect into opportunities within society. And that is probably why I've always worked in the charitable sector. So I started out working for MenCap and working with young people with learning disabilities, and then went on to work with young people to support them to set up social enterprises. And I think that kind of focus on innovation has been a huge thing for me about how we can look differently at societal challenges. And Clarion Futures has entrusted me in looking at innovative projects that can tackle some of the most deep-rooted problems that our communities face. So I've really loved working for Clarion. I've been here about 7 years now in different roles.
And you have mentioned that your work is really involved in intergenerational activity. And do you see intergenerational activity as being innovative in and of itself? Because I do, and even though I do, I'm surprised by that. That we should expect our generations to be so disparate is unusual, really. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's really interesting, and I think that I probably feel similar, that actually we've got to a point in society where we are living in increasingly age-segregated communities, and social isolation and loneliness is on the up. We have a Clarion Index that we do each year where we consult with 2,000 residents across our communities. And social isolation and loneliness is still a big issue for all generations living in our communities. So you're right, it shouldn't be innovative. I guess that the innovation lies in how you go about bringing generations together. So we've had younger and older people coming together to create projects in green spaces. We've had people doing letter writing, oral history sharing. We've had people kind of co-designing and co-delivering projects that have had a great impact across our neighbourhoods. So whilst it isn't innovative in and of itself, the fact that it's not there at the moment, I guess, means that we're trying to be as creative as possible. And we have kind of been trying to lead the way on the concept of intergenerational social action, which again was at least relatively new for the social housing sector, if not a relatively innovative concept more generally as well.
So you've mentioned quite a few different programs, projects that you've worked on there with cross-generational integration. How do you make your programs inclusive of all the people that Clarion serves, because you must really see the full diverse community in the Clarion service users.
I mean, I think engagement's tricky, and, you know, it's really challenging sometimes. I mean, if we're thinking about social isolation and loneliness, there's so much you have to do before you can even get somebody to come along to an event or a community centre. However, one of the ways that we approach our programmes is that we work closely with hyperlocal partners in our areas. We work across 177 local authority areas, which means that actually, you know, with all of the nuances that you would have within different local authorities, we can't be experts in every hyperlocal community. So certainly through our intergenerational work and our youth social action work, we invest in local partners who understand our communities, have those existing relationships, and deliver the models on our behalf. And that's been a really successful approach over the last decade. So we have a community ambassador programme, which we're now using to look at intergenerational social action, which is about supporting younger and older people in our communities to co-design and develop projects themselves. And we've always done that by funding hyperlocal partners to deliver on our behalf.
Okay, so could we dig into one of the programmes that you run? You've mentioned so many, but I'd love to hear in a bit more detail one of your programmes that has been impactful.
Yes, of course. So our community ambassador programme, as I just mentioned, we've been running for over a decade now. And the model is that we will support, it's usually around 10 young people living in one of our communities, to consult with other community members, with their peers, about what the challenges are faced by that community. And then they work together to come up with events, campaigns and social action projects to tackle those challenges. So we would ordinarily do a call out for local organisations that have young people that would want to run a community ambassador programme. And then we would give them a grant to set up that programme, and then lots of training and support on how you deliver successful and impactful social action projects. So we've worked with probably almost 200 local partners to deliver that programme over the last few years. And we've had funding from I Will, which is the campaign for social action, which has really allowed us to scale that work and bring in other housing associations to replicate and use the model for their own communities.
So it's collaboratively built and co-designed and replicable. Those are some really brilliant markers for creating impactful projects, aren't they? You mentioned there that you have guidance you give out on how to set up and deliver an impactful social action project. What are some of those markers?
Yeah, great question again. We know that actually we are working with some really busy local organisations who are delivering youth clubs, they're delivering services that are supporting with the cost of living. So they are really busy people. So we try and shape our support offer around what their needs are at that moment. So we have a learning series that we offer to all new partners. So we will talk about, what is social action, how you can sustain the work that you're doing, how you engage young people. And really that's for partners to dip in and out of. We also know that a lot kind of reaction from the pandemic was that a lot of youth organisations or community organisations are really struggling, and we've seen some fantastic partners really feel under pressure over the last few years. So we also work with organisations like Almond Tree Consultancy to offer capacity building support to partners that are looking to either grow or sustain or actually just sort of develop their inner mechanisms so that they can continue to deliver in our communities. We also offer one-to-one support, and we try and build a network amongst our partners so that they can share learning and best practice between themselves as well. And finally, once a year, we also run a Power of Youth event, which is kind of part of the I Will work that we do, where we invite not just young people, but partners to come along to celebrate, to share their learning and best practice, and also run the sessions themselves around kind of how do we share ideas and creativity around making our communities better places to live in.
One of the ways that we like to learn, certainly I like to learn, is learning from things that don't go so well and what we could have changed to make a success of whatever that project might be. So can you give an example of a program that you've run that hasn't been such a success and what you've learned from that?
Yeah, of course. So when we run our community ambassador program or our social action programs, we are constantly learning and evaluating how we deliver. So we tend to run it in a year cycle. So one of the things that we found after we'd been running the community ambassador program for a couple of years, that young people were saying, actually, like, I love volunteering, but actually I want to understand better how I can take my experiences, my skills, and translate them into the workplace. So we set up a program called the Social Action Youth Connectors. So it was all about young people being paid to connect their peers into opportunities in their communities, and that could be volunteering opportunities. So we had these kind of young youth workers going into communities, and as part of that program, they also got a level 2 in youth work. We had developed this model as a result of consulting with young people, which we do with any program that we design. But as we tested it in practice, we found that actually the commitment to the youth work qualification was probably bigger than we'd anticipated. So we revised our approach for the second phase of the program. And the first thing that we did was we marketed it very differently. And that meant that when we did the second phase of the program, we were able to get the majority of young people to complete their level 2 qualification, which felt like a great success for us, because we knew that it was a model that could have like a fantastic impact, but we needed to get the right people that had the capacity to undertake the whole program to sign up to it.
How do you decide what to focus your time on at Clarion Futures?
So we recently launched our refreshed Clarion Futures strategy, which has a clear roadmap to how Clarion Futures are going to achieve the objectives that we have set out. And, the core to that is making sure that residents do have good wellbeing and can thrive and grow within our communities. So we do make sure that whenever we're looking at new programs, that it does fit within our strategy. And we have an age-friendly strategy, which again kind of steers the direction in which we go. I'm really lucky. I've got a fantastic team that work nationally who kind of lead on various projects. And so that all makes the role both exciting but doable. And we do work really hard to bring in external funding so that we can test new approaches and ideas. So one of the projects that we co-designed with younger residents a few years ago is called Home Truths House, which is all about how we support young people taking on their first tenancy. So they come along to a workshop co-delivered by a young resident and a member of my team, and it gives them all the things that they might need to know when they're setting up in their first home. But it is about kind of empowerment and how you find the answers yourself. So we were really lucky to get funding to grow that program, and that is a big focus of my work, is where we're being told that there's a gap or a need, how do we actually then find a funder or a foundation or a partner that can support us to grow that idea and make it happen.
I'm going to come back to the funding point in just a minute, but first I'm interested to know if all of these programs that you run are intended to serve the residents of Clarion homes. Are other people open to join the programs as well, or are they solely for Clarion residents?
Yeah, so our focus is on Clarion communities, which means that actually not everybody that engages in our programs lives in a Clarion home necessarily. So we're very focused on how we enhance the wider community and not just our own bricks and mortar. So we can work quite holistically and we can make sure that nobody is left out in our communities projects. And that's really important and a real strategic direction for us.
Absolutely. Okay, back to the funding point. So how does the funding work in terms of how much funding comes in through Clarion Housing and how much comes in through external partners?
Yes, so we, because we are a social landlord, the housing group reinvests money into Clarion Futures each year. However, we have targets around matching that income so that we can create more impact. So we invest around 15 million each year into our communities, which sounds like a lot. But if you bear in mind that we have 360,000 people living in our communities and we're working across 177 local authority areas, actually, we really are dependent on bringing in external money. So an example is with the I Will campaign, we match fund that programme, and that is the only way that we could have delivered our youth social action to the scale that we do. And they've been an amazing funder to work with. They really value innovation and new approaches. And also, I think because we are working with some of the most deprived communities in England, I think that's kind of increasing impact to an even greater degree.
Could you speak a bit to what it means to be a social landlord?
Yes. So a social landlord, a housing association, or a social housing association is an organisation that offers reduced rent to those that can perhaps not afford to either buy their own home or to afford private rental costs. However, as a housing association, we do build some shared ownership properties and some private homes in order to reinvest back into our social housing properties.
Okay. And so Clarion Housing as a social landlord and other partners who come in and support with funding, I imagine they want to see what kind of impact that 15 million is making in Clarion communities each year. So do you have quite a robust way of reporting on all of this incredible work that you do?
Yes, absolutely. We create a social value report each year, and you can see that actually for every pound that is put in, we're generating, multiples of that into our communities. So it's absolutely core to how we communicate the impact of the business. And it's really important because, we are more than bricks and mortar. We've probably got one of the largest community investment charities in the country. And that is because we know that our communities really benefit from the work that we do.
And do you use a particular impact framework to report on what you do?
Yeah, so there's, I guess, a number of frameworks. Like most organisations, we have ESG outcomes, but we also work with social value bank. And then we also have a suite of KPIs that we look at as well around engagements with people. And again, that kind of the journey that people come on by working with us or engaging in our programmes. And we did, in terms of our kind of youth social action work, we developed a youth impact framework with UK Youth and the Centre for Youth Impact when we first launched the work. And that gave us a really robust framework to look at the changes that might occur in a young person's life by undertaking youth social action. And that's a framework that we now use with other housing associations who now partner with us on the work.
Okay, and you mentioned a bit earlier in passing that you share internally the impact of the work that you do as well. What kinds of things do you share internally, and what's the impact of that internal comms?
We're a large business, so we have over 3,000 staff that work for Clarion Housing Group. So actually, in terms of your network or partnerships, it's just as important to be engaging internally as externally, because actually only when you join up all parts of our business do you achieve the greatest impact. So my team do a lot of work around internal comms, which can be sharing stories. It can be calling out for people to get involved in our work. We've been shaping an offer for care leavers living in our communities, which has been a relatively new focus area. Not that we haven't supported care leavers for a long time, but we wanted a more kind of cohesive approach or set of kind of commitments that we had around the better support for those with care experience. So our internal comms structures allowed us to reach out to people across the business that might have touch points with those with care experience living in our homes, But it also allowed us to reach out, and actually we now have a steering group that's made up of staff members who also have care experience, as well as those that might be working directly with people. So those kind of internal comms channels are really, really important for us to gain traction and really kind of create programs that are robust and achieve the most impact possible.
And does part of that robustness look like integration across the Clarion group? I'm trying to get here at the more on the relationship between Clarion Futures and Clarion Housing.
Yeah, so I mean, we're collaborative across the business, especially on some of the programs I mentioned, like around care leavers or play, because actually, if you don't have buy-in across the whole group, you don't achieve the impact that you want to.
It sounds like collaboration is absolutely central, not only to the programs that you carry out in external ways, but also internally as an organisation, collaborating between your charitable arm and the business being so key. And I imagine that it must be quite hard when Clarion Housing and Clarion Futures are so entwined, and one is funding quite a lot of the other, to work out what should be a program run by Clarion Futures and what should actually be picked up by Clarion Housing. And how do you go about deciding that split?
Yeah, I don't know whether that really is an issue, to be totally honest. I think that we have, lots of functions as part of the business, and it's quite clear kind of how they operate individually, but how we kind of all operate together in some way. I mean, the one thing that is really important is that you've got really clear communication about kind of what you do and what your offer is as a service within the business. I don't think there's much replication, in all honesty. And I guess the fact that we do have quite clear strategies as different parts of the business really helps that. But we do always call on colleagues that perhaps might be experts in certain areas or might already have relationships within our communities when we're trying to develop, design and deliver projects and programs.
And when you're designing specific programs, do you ever have a moment of thinking this should be work that is central to this housing association rather than reliant on the charitable arm?
I don't think so, because I think that we obviously have core services which we're contracted to deliver, and then in terms of Clarion Futures, some of what we do is that kind of being more than bricks and mortar and adding value to the core work that we deliver, and some of it is about facilitating different parts of the business to come together. So, for instance, we developed a play strategy which was about how we promote safe play in our communities. So we had our housing colleagues looking at how we could take down no ball game signs. We've had our development colleagues looking at actually how we develop more nature-based play spaces in our new developments. And then for Clarion Futures, it's about how we invest in local projects that encourage play. So I don't think there's anything about whose role it is. I think that can be really clear, but it's incredibly important that we work together on these key themes. And if not, again, we don't have the sustainable impact that we want.
It's so wonderful to hear you talk about the play work that you're doing. Action Funder, as you know, has grown both backyard nature to get nature into very local areas that youth can engage with, and also grown Outdoor Classroom Day, which is very focused on play and getting kids across the world outdoors to learn and play. And something as simple as taking down no ball games signs can have a really big impact on how a space is used. What are some of the other tactics that you've used in those play campaigns?
Yeah, so I think that one of the reasons why we collaborate so closely with Backyard Nature is that we see play and green spaces as being part of very much the same piece. It's about how we do get younger, older people outdoors and embracing nature, the nature that's on their doorstep, or the spaces that they have available to them. And actually, in terms of kind of our play campaign, it's very much part of that, about how we do encourage play. And it does sit within the sustainability work that we're doing to look at how we do ensure that we have spaces that are available to people. We wanted to ensure that communities understood about how you differentiate between ASB and play, because, we do feel that children have the right to play, but that has to be in a safe environment, and it has to be where it isn't creating antisocial behaviour issues. So, it's a long process, but we're committed to looking at how we move through some of the challenges in our communities to provide play. And we've also been closing streets, and that very much is about giving parents some of that kind of reassurance that their children playing out can be a really positive thing. And we're now moving into where we're trying to look at launching a play champions network, so that we have residents leading on play themselves within their communities, with a bit of support from Clarion Futures. We've been looking at how we can influence new developments to think a bit more creatively about play. And again, that has been like a big kind of internal push as well, about getting housing officers to tell us when they're seeing good and bad examples of play across our communities.
So a project like this will have involved co-design with residents and the Clarion Housing business side, as well as local authorities, I imagine. A lot of moving parts and collaborations going on there. What's it like to get all of these different people around different tables talking about being playful?
Oh, well, I love it. It's definitely the best bit of your job, really, especially when you're first trying to co-design something. So we worked with community members as well as internal staff, and we did a series of workshops when we were designing the play strategy. So the first thing that I would say is that we always work with an expert partner. So we work really closely with Playing Out, which is a business based in Bristol, who championed the Play Streets campaign. So when we we were working closely with them, and we ran these workshops, and the first question we asked was, what's your first memory of play? And it was just the most fantastic kind of response from some really senior development directors to like communities officers working on the ground. And it really kind of freed people up to take off their work hat and talk like very openly about what play meant to them. And what was so fascinating was that almost everyone only talked about natural play and about kind of doing things that were a little bit risky and coming back late and all of those things that kind of are part of childhood, rather than talking about physical playgrounds. And it really kind of got us thinking, what is our approach here? And I think that has kind of led us to think about nature play and why we wanted to work so closely with Action Funder and Backyard Nature, because actually some of our communities have very, our central London housing, and we have a lot of stock in London. They might not have a garden or a piece of grass that sits within their own property. So we wanted to kind of get the communities to think creatively about how you do kind of build nature in your backyard, but what other spaces and places and play is available to them.
In a minute, I'm going to ask you to give one action that people listening can take away. But before I ask that question, I want to ask everyone listening to think about their first experience of play. Because I think often in a work context, we can get so serious, and often around a board table, we can manage to lose all common sense. And we get so focused on the intricacies of process rather than being playful and creative and therefore innovative in the work that we do with a reasonable kind of rational common sense angle on it. That can be a hugely powerful thing to take into a business. So I'd like everyone listening to think about that. And I want to ask you what your first experience of play was.
I grew up on a housing estate in the West Midlands in Halesowen. I'm sure most of you won't have heard of that, in Dudley. And we used to go around to a Chadbury Park, and it was right in the centre of our community. From a really young age. I mean, interestingly, statistically, in the 1980s, which is when I was born, the average age to play out was 8, and it is now 11. So that's food for thought for parents like me out there. So we used to go to Chadbury Park, and there was a little brook there was a play area that literally nobody played on, and we would be in this brook or this little stream that was probably rat infested. We'd always have a rope swing on the go. So I think my first memory of play was being down there and then having my mum repeatedly storming down the road because I was late getting home. So that was definitely my first memory of play. But I did just want to say that I think what you said there about kind of allowing for creativity is so important in whatever roles we're doing. And I mentioned that we've launched this Good Ideas Fund at Clarion. And, that really is about the business saying, we want to allow you to have some space to think outside of like the day-to-day mechanisms of your role, to like tell us what it is you're seeing on the ground, what, your ideas are to change things that have probably been going in the same way for a long, long time. And so, I really back that. I think that we all have that creativity and innovation in us. And actually it is for businesses to allow that time for people to just step away momentarily from their roles and use all that kind of insight that they've got to look at how we can do things even better. So I just wanted to say that's a really good point.
Perfect. That's what I like to hear. That what I'm reflecting back is being useful. It's so important to have play in our lives, and it's so important to give ourselves the space to be imaginative and innovative and to take action, which is what I'm going to come on to. Because it can be that we get so busy responding to emails and having conversations and pushing forward with the same old status quo that it's hard to step back, see what needs to change and take action on that. And so can you give listeners just one action that you suggest that we all take today to start making a positive impact in our workplaces?
Yes, I was really thinking about this while we were chatting. And I guess one of the things that's probably bothered me over the last couple of years is that I think when we were all in lockdown, we had these like connections within our communities that we'd never had before. And, we were knocking on older neighbours' doors and offering to go and do shopping for them. And we commissioned a really interesting report about how you sustain those intergenerational connections that came out of crisis. And I think sadly, some of them have like whittled away a little bit. So I guess my kind of action for everyone would be like, go and have a conversation with someone that is not your generation. Just go and like knock on someone's door, check in how they are. Like the relationships that you can build, those intergenerational relationships can impact you for a lifetime. I think my nan totally shaped who I am and what I wanted to do and my direction. And I think that sadly a lot of people don't have that kind of that other generation in their lives that can, tell them what things used to be like and, speak honestly about kind of life, etc. So I think my action would be go and have a conversation with someone that you wouldn't ordinarily, that's of a different generation.
Have that conversation and then see how it impacts the work that you do. You never know how those conversations and relationships will impact all sorts of different avenues of your life. Just adding on to what you were saying there, Sarah, thank you so much. It's been absolutely brilliant to hear about Clarion Futures and some of the many programs that you're running and the positive impact that you're having through your day-to-day work. So thank you for joining us.
No, thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Breaking the Mold. Join us next month when we feature another brilliant voice from the world of positive impact. To be notified when that next episode drops, simply subscribe on your podcast player. In the meantime, visit actionfunder.org to find out more about leaders driving change in our communities. While you're there, make the most of the tools on site to search grassroots nonprofits and learn how to make an impact on people, planet and profit. Finally, we'd hugely appreciate you taking a moment to rate and review the podcast. It really helps new listeners find the show. Thanks again for listening and see you next time.